Today we're talking about the Evil Wreckoning. I owned my Evil Wreckoning during peak COVID, so I held on to it for a bit longer than usual. I was really impressed with this bike, but how does it compare today? Before we get into it, please subscribe and hit that like button so you don't miss an upload. New videos are every Friday, and I'm doing bonus comparisons all month long, so drop a comment with what bikes you'd like to see compared. It's the holidays, so check out my affiliate links to support the channel and pick up something for yourself or your ride. Now let's get into it. This is the second entirely new Wreckoning, and while the LS, or lightly salted, has a few small updates, there were no changes to geometry, construction, or suspension. So if you want more details, check out my original video here. I had some amazing times on this bike, including my first time seeing In-N-Out Burger and Garanga. So many rock faces, and so many new places and new trails. This may still be my favorite dual 2.9 enduro bike. That's not to say it's the best for everyone, or the best at everything, so we'll talk about who it's for later in this video. This was only my third 2.9er ever, and while I was impressed with the first generation of the Wreckoning, it was the first generation Santa Cruz Mega Tower that finally made me believe in 2.9ers, at least for my riding. This bike was released at the same time that Fox introduced the 38 and RockShox the Zeb, which was a huge part in the evolution of these long travel 2.9ers. My Wreckoning stayed nearly stock, and I used it to check out some tires and my first ever electronic shifting. I mentioned in my initial review, even with heavy tires, the Wreckoning stayed pretty light. I found that whether set up in the low or extra low configuration, I could easily find confidence in the Wreckoning, but eventually I settled on the extra low. Let's get into the fun stuff. With that RockShox Zeb, I mentioned this is an incredibly balanced bike. That's not to say it's balanced front to back as some bikes, like the new Rocky Mountain Altitude, but more balanced as far as the stiffness and suspension. On jumps, corners, and in the steeps, that super short rear end keeps weight on the rear wheel and allows for a ton of pop. A bike that pumps around tight corners better than nearly any other 2.9er I've ridden. And combined with a high front end, begs to creep down the steepest rocks and chutes. As you can probably tell from my videos, those are the things I really enjoy, so that's a large part of my fondness for the Evil Wreckoning. At the limit and in the chunkiest terrain, it does become apparent why chainstays have increased in length. When compared to my Transition Spire or the all-new Rocky Mountain Altitude, the Wreckoning gets a bit more unsettled with consecutive hits. At slow and mid speed, the Delta suspension does such a great job of tracking the ground, but especially in the dry, when the speeds really increase, managing those speeds requires shifting your weight in a way that can feel a bit unnerving. In the wet though, the Delta suspension continues to impress. I mentioned how well the Wreckoning pumps corners, but in the longer, flat, wider, chunky turns, like what you often find in a bike park, is another place you'll want to ride that front end. The front to back balance also puts a lot of weight on the back wheel, especially on the flat drops. I'm excited what is to come from Evil, but if I'm honest, I'm not necessarily hoping they increase the rear center. I think the market is demanding it, but I worry it will lose some of that all-out fun. I rode so many features for the first time on this bike. Garanga, the Chief, Blue Steel. Whether big jumps, drops, or heinous rock features, the Evil Wreckoning kept coming back for more. It may not be the fastest bike for every rider, but for me, it's just the most fun. And it strikes a great balance of confidence versus playfulness. Did I mention it's quiet? So what about the climb? This is where newer bikes start to rack up points in the Loam library. Steeper seat tubes and longer rear centers do a lot for body position and making the climb that much easier. The Wreckoning, however, is no slouch. Efficiency is very good and traction is outstanding. However, it's the body position that makes switchbacks something you have to work for, and steep technical climbs require a fair bit of body English to keep that front end down, especially when set up in the extra low setting. Overall, the Wreckoning may not be the sprightliest climber, but it'll get you to the top without much trouble.
Oh yeah.
So how's the bike held up? Fit and finish may not quite be as good as, say, my 5010. Specifically, the paint finish is kind of inconsistent across the whole frame, but after well over a year and a lot of wet riding, it looks pretty good. There are some paint chips exposing the white primer or base coat, but not as bad as some bikes I've had from much larger manufacturers. I should mention this spot chewed up rocks, sticks, and the paint. I just had to make sure I cleared it out every once in a while. I went through a number of the tiny bearings in the linkage, but never had much issue changing them out. The main pivot stayed tight and the bearings smooth. Evil bikes also have a lifetime warranty on the bearings, which is huge. The guides for brake hoses, shifter, and the back of the main triangle did work their way out, but it's more of a visual bother, and I never noticed them causing any rattles. The stock Industry 9 wheels had more issues than I've had in a bit with popping spokes. This is where I wish Evil used the more common 148 rear end, but when I reached out to i9, they informed me that this was an issue and they sent me a new set of spokes as well as a rim. So it wasn't a big problem, but it would have been expensive if I couldn't build my own wheels. And like I said before, due to the rear weight bias, the bike is hard on rear rims. This is also the bike where I learned about spring fatigue. My Mega Tower had a coil shock, but due to that suspension design, I was never able to get the coil how I would like it. So I don't know if I ever wore that one out. The Wreckoning, on the other hand, was so good with the coil. Bottoms weren't overly harsh and traction was insane. But one day I noticed that I was bottoming. It got worse and I reached out to the shock house to see if I needed the shock rebuilt or what they thought. After Mike had a look at it and asked me about my riding and how much time I had on it, he told me about spring fatigue. I threw on a new coil and it was off to the races. Similar circumstance, one day I started getting a bit more chain slap and noise. Turns out that EXO rear derailleur got very tired and the clutch completely died. I decided rather than spend $100 some on the new EXO 1 derailleur, I'd throw all the money at it and try GX Axis, and that mostly solved the problems. So overall, while the initial finish wasn't quite where I thought it should be, the frame held up very well, and with basic maintenance, it's still running strong under my buddy Ryan. So how's the Evil Wreckoning stack up in the Loam library? A solid 38 puts it here among other 160 to 170 bikes. Climbing efficiency and traction are excellent, but it struggles a bit with body position and switchbacks. On the fun side of the chart, it's possibly the best jumping 2.9er. It rips corners and confidently takes on steep terrain. Value and quality mean a lot more on these long-term reviews, and while the entry price is a bit high, Evil doesn't play games. You get the highest quality suspension and brakes as well as some pretty nice wheels, regardless of the drivetrain. There were no catastrophic failures, and the lifetime bearing warranty adds to the value. Let's talk comparisons. First off, how does this bike sit in the Evil lineup? Well, compared to the Evil offering, the Wreckoning is a significantly more burly bike. It's the bike you want for the bigger hits, jumps, and going fast. The offering, on the other hand, is more of a solid all-mountain trail bike. It can handle a lot of what the Wreckoning can, but relies more on the rider. It also feels a little more up to date as far as reach and seat angle. So while the back end is still short, it climbs much more comparable to the newest stuff out there. The bike that really steps on the wrecker's toes is the Insurgent. These bikes can pretty easily be interchanged, but I would say the Wreckoning with its dual 29-inch wheels is the choice for some part-time racing. If you want the more free-ride trick option, go Insurgent. Or if you're on the shorter side, it's probably also the better choice. Woo! Now, how does it compare against the Transition Spire? This was my next bike and a really fun comparison. First off, climbing, the body position was a big change. Efficiency wasn't noticeably better, but overall climbing was improved. I preferred the suspension of the Evil for jumping in techie terrain, but it was obvious in places like Whistler that the Spire was more stable. Another good example of the difference is that I started Blue Steel on the Evil, but didn't complete it until the Spire. This may have been more of a timing thing, but after getting a little too loose on the Evil, I had to call it a day. It was a bit until I got back, and while the Spire wasn't as maneuverable, it made quick work of those massive jumps. The Spire also did a lot for making me just more comfortable on some of these bigger features, and I would eventually go back and do many of those things on much smaller bikes like the Following or the Santa Cruz 5010. The next bike I want to compare it to is the new Rocky Mountain Altitude. This bike was entirely new this year, and I was impressed from day one. It's a good example of how things have changed. Climbing wise, the Evil actually is a bit more efficient, but when things are chunky or steep, the Rocky keeps chugging away while the Evil needs you to be a bit more active. Descending, the Altitude really feels like a race bike. It rides so much longer. It takes the confidence of that Transition Spire and turns it up a notch. Traction both slow and fast is incredible. Creeping into things, both the Evil and Rocky are composed, but letting it rip, the Rocky comes out on top. You can also see Rocky's different approach to setup. The Altitude has so many adjustments, whether it's the Ride 4 system, or the Reach Adjust headset, or the bullet options. Evil just has the lower extra low, and while you can opt for an angle adjust headset, it's more the traditional Preston cups.
Oh, it's definitely loose down there.
When it really comes down to it, the Evil just has more attitude and is just fun on a wider range of trails. The Altitude needs that speed to really come alive. Woo!
Ride.
Final thoughts, and who's this bike for? I really hope Evil stays with their free ride and fun ethos. Bikes keep getting easier to ride everywhere, but that can make them less fun on the edges. Sure, on big jumps, the Spire may have felt more composed, and at high speed, it was going to stay straight. But what if you wanted two-wheel drift, get loose, and sideways? Then the Evil Wreckoning is for you. It's still an enduro bike, or a mini DH bike, as Evil calls it, but like that would suggest, it's got more free ride routes. It's still going to help you ride out mistakes, but it's also going to encourage you to make those mistakes in the first place. The Evil allows for creativity and doesn't feel sanitized. What can I say? I like my bikes with some edge. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't. We're doing bonus comparison videos all month that you're not going to want to miss. New videos drop every Friday. If you need anything for yourself or your ride, it's the holidays, so hit up Jensen USA and the other affiliate links on my channel's page. These support the channel at no additional cost to you. Now get out there, go fast, and take chances. See you next week.